What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards, old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. This week on Not Your Average Meta, we have our second to last game of the season that includes the return of a couple surprise players. First up this week, we have Eric coming back for his first appearance since episode 47, playing Kodama of the West Tree. This deck looks to pump out creatures with +1/+1 counters in order to take advantage of his commander's ability to let him run over his opponents with trample damage. Next, we have Eli back, making his first appearance on the channel since episode 40, playing Halana and Alena partners. This deck looks to use his commander in order to pump up his creatures with +1/+1 counters so he can run over his opponents for the win. Then we have Fograwal back, playing his mono-red Varchild Betrayal of Kjeldor deck. This is a mono-red Voltron deck that looks to give his opponent survivors and then punish them in weird ways for having an abundance of creatures. Finally, we have Justin also returning, playing his mono-black deck being led by Shirei, Shizo's Caretaker. This deck is looking to take advantage of his creatures dying combined with his commander's ability to return them to play for ultimate recurring value. Now we have our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Eric plays a Forest and pays 1 to cast an Elvish Mystic. Eli plays his Stomping Grounds, paying 2 life to play it untapped, and then pays 1 for Hardened Scales. Fog draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard for turn. He then uses it, giving Eli a Spirit token in order to cast a Soul Ring. Justin draws, plays a Swamp for turn, and then pays 1 to cast a Nested Shambler. Eric plays a Fabled Passage for turn before paying to cast a Green Sun Zenith for 0, going to get a Dryad Arbor from his library. He then shortcuts by sacking his passage to go get a Forest while he swings 1 damage at Fog. Eli draws and plays a Tap Vastwood Thicket for turn before passing. Fog draws and plays a Mountain for turn before paying 3 to cast his commander, Varchild. Justin plays a Swamp for turn that pays 2 for a Priest of Forgotten Gods. Eric draws for turn that remembers that Zenith was supposed to be shuffled back into his library, so he bottoms it and then plays a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. Eli draws and plays a Karn's Bastion. He then pays 3 to cast a Rishkar's Pima Renegade, putting a counter on both Rishkar and a Spirit token. Fog draws and pays 3 for Tenzo Goto's Maul before paying 1, which gives Eric a Spirit token in order to equip the Maul to his commander. He then swings his commander Eli, who doesn't block, and takes his 6 damage, which gives him 6 survivor tokens. Fog then exiles 2 red cards from his hand in order to free cast Fury of the Horde. He then untaps his commander and takes a second combat step, this time swinging at Justin for 6 damage. Justin also doesn't block and takes a 6 damage, which gives him 6 survivor tokens. Justin draws and plays a Swamp for turn. He then uses his Priest to sack 2 survivor tokens, causing his opponents to each sack a creature and lose 2 life, while he draws a card and gains 2 black mana. Fog then gains control of all the survivor tokens when his commander loses play, while Justin then casts his commander, Shirei. On his end step, Eric flashes in Endurance to put his graveyard on the bottom of his library. Eric draws and plays a land for turn. He then taps out to cast a Voracious Hydra, which enters the battlefield with 8 +1/+1 counters on it. Eli plays a Yavimaya Cradle of Growth for turn. He then taps out to cast his commander, Halana and Alena, before going to combat and adding 4 +1/+1 counters to his Spirit token. Fog draws and pays 3 for a Kusarigama before passing. Justin draws and plays a Swamp before paying 1 for a Stitcher's Supplier, milling 3 cards into his graveyard. He then uses his Priest to sack his 2 creatures, causing his opponents to each sack a creature and lose 2 life, while he draws a card and gains 2 black mana. Justin then mills 3 more cards, creates a Squirrel token, and casts a Dictate of Erebos. He then returns his creatures back to play on his end step and mills 3 more cards. Eric draws and casts Eternal Witness, which returns his Dryad Arbor to his hand. He then plays a Dryad Arbor for turn. He then pays 3 to cast his commander, Kodama, and goes to combat, swinging his Hydra, Justin, who blocks with his Shambler. This then causes each player to sack a creature. He then takes the rest of the 7 damage. Eric's commander then triggers and he goes to get a Forest from his library. Eli draws for turn and plays a Rockfall Veil. He then pays 3 for a Branching Evolution and passes. Fog draws, misses another land drop, and then pays 3 to cast a Crown of Doom. Justin draws and casts a Bastion of Remembrance, creating a 1/1 human token. He then uses his priest to sack 2 of his creatures, causing his opponents to each sack a creature and lose 2 life, while he draws a card and gains 2 black mana. Each opponent then loses an additional 2 life while he gains another 2 life off his bastion. Justin then casts an Altar of Dementia, a Knight of Even Legion, and returns his Shambler back to play at the beginning of his end step. Before the end of his turn, Eli channels his Beseju to bounce the Dictate back to Justin's hand. Justin then goes into his library to find a swamp to put into play. Eric draws and plays a Forgotten Ancient. He then pays to cast a Finale of Devastation for 2, going to find a Sakura Tribe Elder from his library. Before Eric's end step, Justin sacks 3 of his creatures to his altar, milling each opponent for 1 card and causing each opponent to lose 3 life while he gains 3 life. On the end step, he then returns him to play. Eli draws and plays a Mountain for turn. He then pays 4 for a Druid of Purification, and on ETB, Eli chooses Fog's Crown, while Fog and Eric pick Justin's Altar and Bastion. All 3 permanents then get destroyed, and Eli passes. Fog draws for turn, misses another land drop, and then pays 1 for an Own Naginata. Justin draws for turn, then uses his priest to once again sack 2 creatures. This then is each opponent losing 2 life and sacking a creature while he draws a card and gains 2 black mana. He then pays to cast Bottle Gnomes, a Fell Spectre, picking Eric to discard a card, and then he returns his creatures to play on his end step. On his upkeep, Eric moves his Ancient's counters onto the Endurance and draws for turn. He then goes to combat and swings his Hydra at Eli. Eli then takes his damage, and Eric goes to find a land from his library to put to play off his commander's trigger. Eli draws and plays a Thundering Nightmare for turn. Out of the kindness of his heart, Fog then taps his Orchard to give Eli a Spirit Token to soulbond to his Nightmare. Fog draws for turn and then uses his Soul Ring to cast a Scroll of the Masters, before paying 1 to cast a Blasphemous Act. The Sin wipes the board of all the creatures and puts a counter on his scroll, while Justin gains 3 life and mills 3 cards. Justin draws for turn and then pays 3 to cast a Skullport Merchant, creating a treasure token when she enters. Eric draws, plays a Castle Garenbreg, and passes. Eli draws and taps out to cast a Bane of Progress. The Sin destroys all the enchantments and artifacts in play and has him entering play with 7+1/+1 counters. Fog draws and misses a land drop. Justin plays a Swamp for turn. He then pays 4 for a Mindless Automaton and then pays another 2 to sack a Squirrel and draw a card. Eric draws for turn, then pays 2 for a Sylvan Library, and then another 5 to recast his commander a second time. Eli draws for turn and then pays 3 for a Rhythm of the Wild. He then goes to combat, swinging his Bane of Progress at Justin, who takes the damage. He then casts a Hangerback Walker for 0, but he still enters with a +1/+1 counter because of the Rhythm of the Wild trigger. Fog draws, miraculously hits a 3rd land, and passes his turn. Justin draws for turn and then plays a Swamp. He then pays 5 to cast Lull, Spider Queen, and downtakes her to create 2 Spider tokens. On his upkeep, Eric draws 2 extra cards because of his library, paying the 8 life to keep both. He then pays 4 for a Force of Vigor, targeting Eli's Walker and enchantment. The Sin destroys them both and gives Eli a 1/1 Thopter token. He then pays to draw a card off his War Room and casts a Green Sun Zend for 1, going to get a Birds of Paradise from his library. Eli plays an untapped Spire Garden for turn that pays enough mana to recast his commander a second time. He then goes to combat, triggering his commander, and puts 2 +1/+1 counters on his Thopter token. Fog draws and pays 1 to cast a Manifold Key before passing. On his end step, Justin pays to sack a Spider and draw a card, which then puts a counter on Lilith. Justin draws and plays a Swamp for turn. He then pays to recast his commander again, and then pays another 1 to cast a Death Cultist. Justin then zeros Lilith to lose a life and draw a card. On his upkeep, Eric draws 2 extra cards because of his library and chooses not to pay any life. He then pays 6 to cast a Chord of Calling in order to get an Averbark Caretaker from his library to put to play. Eric then goes to combat and puts a 1/1 counter on his bird and swings it at Lilith. In response, Justin removes the counters from his automaton to draw a card. He then adds a counter to Lilith and she takes the damage, going to 1 loyalty. Eli draws and goes to combat, putting 2 more counters on his Thopter token before swinging at Lilith, taking her out. He He then pays to cast an Armorcraft Judge, which enters the battlefield and has him drawing 3 cards. Eli then plays his land for turn to cast a Blade Elite, and before his end step, Justin sacks his Cultist to deal damage to Eli and gain a life, as well as removing the counters from his Automaton to draw a card. His creatures then return on Eli's end step. Fog draws for turn and then goes to his end step, where Justin sacks his Automaton to draw a card, sacks his Cultist to deal damage to Eli and gain a life, and then returns his creatures to play on Fog's end step. Justin draws for turn while Eric remembers to flip his Caretaker over into the Hollow Hinge Huntmaster. He then casts a Sky Scanner drawing a card, a Spawning Pit, a Dark Privilege targeting Shirei, a Viscerous Seer, and finally a Blood Pet. Justin then sacks his Cultist to deal another damage to Eli, gaining a life, and removes the counters from his Automaton to draw a card. They then return on his end step and he passes. On his upkeep, Eric flips his Huntmaster back into his Caretaker and draws 3 cards off his library trigger. He then chooses to pay 4 life to keep 1 extra card. He then pays 2 for a Scavenging Ooze and another 10 to cast an Apex Devastator. This then has him cascading 4 times. Eric then resolves his Cascade triggers, putting to play his own Bane of Progress, destroying all the artifacts and enchantments in play, and then puts to play a Craterhoof Behemoth, as well as a Hardened Scales and a Nyx Blumation. He then goes to combat and puts a counter on his commander before swinging his bird at Eli, his Behemoth and commander Justin, and his Caretaker at Fog. Justin then blocks some of the damage while everybody else takes the rest of their damage. Eric then goes to find lands from his library to put to play, while Eli casts a Nature's Claim to destroy Eric's Nyx Blumation, gaining him 4 life. Eric then exiles a card from Justin's graveyard to gain another life, and on his end step, Justin's creatures return to play. Eli draws for turn and pays 6 for Rishkar's Expertise, which has him drawing 7 cards. He then casts a Chandra's Ignition for free, targeting the Bane of Progress, which deals 9 damage to each of the creatures, wiping the board, and 9 damage to each of his opponents. This then takes Justin out of the game. Eli then casts a Soul Ring, and then a Sakura Tribe Elder, before going to combat swinging his Bane at Eric for 9 damage. Fog draws for turn, then passes. Eric draws for turn and then casts an Oran Reef Ooze, as well as recasting his commander a 3rd time. He then goes to combat swinging his Devastator to Eli, taking him out of the game, while Fog decides to also scoop it up. Since you forgot to do a post-game interview this game, we're going to go old school and I'm going to give my thoughts on the winner of today's game. The winner of today's game was Eric, playing a mono green deck. Surprise, surprise, mono green got another win on the channel. After seeing both Ryan and Eric's Kodama the West Street decks be played multiple times, it's pretty apparent that it was very undervalued at the release of Kamigawa. I definitely think he should be played more as a commander because his ability to give all the plus and counter creatures trample is just really good. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.